Director here at GTI. GTI is a 501(c)(3) think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research. Our mission is to support the US-Taiwan relationship and Taiwan's relations with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include our biweekly Global Taiwan brief, seminars, annual symposium, podcasts, as well as scholarship and fellowship opportunities for researchers interested in Taiwan studies. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you should do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. So let's begin today's program. Earlier this month, the United States held its national elections that saw former President Donald J. Trump reelected as the 47th president of the United States, as well as a shift in the power dynamics within the U.S. Congress. President-elect Trump won the Electoral College with 312 votes to his Democratic challengers 226, and the popular vote with 70.67 million to 74.2 million. This is unlike in 2016 when then Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. The Republican Party also achieved the trifecta. The party now controlling not only the presidency, but also both chambers of the legislative branch of the U.S. government. Now, in a period of global disruptions, these results could have significant implications for U.S.-Taiwan relations, but not only, also international relations. Like other allies and partners, Taiwan faces pressing questions on how the president-elect's policy might shift relations across the diplomatic, economic, and security domains as compared to prior administrations. The 47th president and his transition team have already indicated that they intend to thoroughly review the entire U.S. government's bureaucracies and policies with a fine-tooth comb. And Taiwan policy cannot be taken for granted as an exception. Taiwan, for its part, seems to be approaching Trump 2.0 with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Anticipation because while past performances is not indicative of future results, the record of his first administration does provide a basis for which to assess how a second Trump administration may approach its Taiwan policy. I think that observers can all objectively agree that progress on a whole was positive during those 4 years of Trump administration. Anxiety, because President-elect Trump is strategically unpredictable and transactional. And moreover, the Trump of 2024 is not the Trump of 2016. So GTI is very, very delighted to be able to organize this panel discussion here today. And particularly so because I think this is the first time that we have been able to convene our own cohorts of senior fellows of GTI. For them to consider and for us to discuss the potential impacts of a Trump 2.0 for Taiwan policy on multiple fronts. From the role of Congress, which, as I also mentioned, has seen a shift in the power dynamics over the last 4 years, as well as across the domains of diplomatic, security, economic issues. We will also examine China's assessment of this situation as well. So allow me to introduce them just briefly, our really esteemed speakers and colleagues and friends. First, we have Annie Pololowski, who is a senior non-resident fellow here at GTI. In her prior position, she led the Indo-Pacific portfolio as a senior professional staff member of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs. She had also served as an Indo-Pacific senior policy analyst on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Next, we will have Riley Walters. I'm introducing them in the order in which they'll be speaking. Riley Walters, who is also a senior non-resident fellow here at GPI, and also concurrently a senior fellow at the Taiwan Institute. After Riley, we'll have Mike Mazza, also a senior non-resident fellow here, as well as a senior director over at the Project 2049 Institute, and a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise. Last but not least, and to my immediate left, we have Eric Chan, also a senior non-resident fellow here at GTI, and previously the China, Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam country director at the Secretary of the Air Force International Affairs. I've asked each of them to prepare no more than about 10 minutes for their opening comments, and after which I will facilitate a conversation discussion about the subject matter. Do want to hear from those of you in the audience, so we've reserved around 15 minutes at the end of the session to take your questions. For those of you joining us online, we do want to hear from you as well, and you may engage in this conversation by posing your question and sending them to contact@globaltaiwan.org or utilizing the YouTube chat function on the YouTube page. I believe you can also tweet us at Global Taiwan. I'll repeat these instructions again as we approach the end of the session. And so with that, let me turn it over to Annie.
Thank you to Russell for inviting us all to speak, and thank you to the Global Taiwan Institute staff for putting together this event. Really appreciate it. Let's start with general trend lines on President-elect Trump and his Taiwan views and what a GOP-controlled Congress might look like on Taiwan policy, and then dive into some outstanding questions that I believe are still out there. I'm happy to dive deeper into any of these points in the Q&A. So on Trump on Taiwan, obviously there's a lot in the news about things that Trump has said about Taiwan and Taiwan policy. I think most notably, you hear a lot about Trump saying that Taiwan has stolen the US chip industry and that Taiwan needs to pay us for defense. But as the old adage goes, I want to urge folks to watch what he does and not what he says. As we know, President-elect Trump has a history of kind of saying what he needs to say to gain leverage and doing something very different. So if we look at the first Trump presidency, we see, as Russell mentioned in the opening, some positive trend lines on Taiwan policy. We saw one of the largest arms sales packages approved very early in the Trump presidency. We saw, no real cumulative economic action against Taiwan throughout the 4 years of the presidency. We saw a lot of high-level government visits as well. So Russell also mentioned that Trump has the, for being a little bit unpredictable. While that may be true in some cases, I think in other cases, he's remarkably consistent. So some things that we've seen that President-elect Trump has been very consistent about are burden sharing. He doesn't want allies to be off of US trade promises. Second is he cares a lot about trade deficits. We've heard from previous Trump officials that when Trump looks at bilateral relations with other countries, first and foremost, he looks at it through our trade imbalances. And the third, we know that the Trump he cares a lot about supporting US manufacturing. So if Taiwan were to find ways to address those main core interests of the future Trump presidency, I think that would really be really beneficial. All the colleagues to dive deeper. I'm mostly biased as a former Hill staffer, and Russell is tired of hearing me say this, but I think we tend to forget that really it was Congress that was the leader and who set the forefront of US policy on Taiwan, most notably with the Taiwan Relations Act, which is still the foundational document. It dictates basically all of US relationships with Taiwan. So, and we've seen Congress over the past 4 years in particular really take a more active role in being prescriptive about what the relationship with the United States and our relationship with Taiwan should look like in today's changing geopolitical environment. The geopolitical environment has obviously changed a lot since the Taiwan Relations Act was passed in 1979. You have a couple of very strong voices on the Hill in Taiwan that were picked up by the admin, most notably Representative Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and Senator Rubio, Secretary of State. And both of those have been very vocal on specific issues on Taiwan. So we can see some executive branch direction on Taiwan that may change. So Senator Rubio, for example, has been pretty vocal about engagement with Taiwan and the Taiwanese government. So in his role as Secretary of State, we can probably expect some changes to the contact guidelines with Taiwan to facilitate more high-level contact with the Taiwanese government. And of course, Representative Waltz has said a lot about strengthening U.S. posture in the Indo-Pacific to deter China. So you can expect some White House level direction for the agencies to realign resources to strengthen that posture. But ultimately, Congress is, a separate branch of government, and Congress, like any branch of government, does not like ceding control. I think it's unlikely to give up too much power on Taiwan policy to the executive branch, and I think Congress will still play kind of a forefront and a leading role in setting U.S. policy towards Taiwan. I think this is especially true after the Supreme Court Chevron decision, which basically forces Congress to be more prescriptive in its legislative language if it wants agencies to actually implement policies in accordance with congressional intent. So what this means, generally, is that the trend lines that we see in Congress on Taiwan are likely to stay. So some trend lines that we've seen is a push for more pre-positioning and training in Taiwan. The Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act that mirrors the law in the 22 NDAA. In addition to the foreign military financing account that it sets up, which tends to get the most media attention, it also authorizes the war reserve stockpiles in Taiwan and presidential drawdown authority. And we've seen from congressional oversight over the past 2 years that there's been some concern in Congress that these authorities are being drawn out and are not being implemented in the way that the legislation first intended. We see Congress loves financial action, so we can expect maybe some more laws on financial action against the PRC if the PRC were to act on Taiwan. So Congress loves the sanctions legislation, of course. And there's been discussions about freezing assets of PRC officials that are involved in the Taiwan blockade scenario. And then, of course, there's an active discussion right now of revoking PNTR on China. So we can see that also on the congressional side, but also, Representative Stefanik was a supporter of sanctions against China in the case of blockade or invasion scenario on Taiwan. So she'll be over at the United Nations most likely, and pulls for multilateral support on that as well. What I mentioned previously, some more high-level government-to-government contacts. I expect a more high-level U.S. government executive branch contact with Taiwan, but also congressional. You don't have, highly doubt you'll see anyone in Trump presidency, so we shouldn't be visiting. I even expect a speaker's visit. More congressional movement on tax and trade with Taiwan. Obviously, next year, Congress has to consider reauthorization of the tax bill. One thing that people have been talking about that's been percolating in Congress is an anti-double taxation for Taiwanese companies in the US. It's a pretty easy political sell to say Taiwanese companies should not be taxed more than Chinese companies when they invest in the US. And of course, this also aligns with Trump president priorities because tax incentives for Taiwanese companies to invest in the US helps address the trade deficit issue as well. And then, of course, Taiwan's participation in international organizations. Congress has been very forward-leaning on advocating for that, so we can expect to see more of those trends too. In terms of outstanding questions on what a Trump presidency and Congress might look like on Taiwan, a question that is very often mentioned in the media is, will Trump bargain away Taiwan, right? It's a great negotiator, anything's on the table as long as it gets a deal. At the outset, I think it's generally unlikely that Trump will bargain away Taiwan for a number of reasons. And I'm actually interested to hear what my fellow analysts might have to say on this. But first, at the outset, I don't think that Trump is going to hold back on any actions on China, right? This is a great negotiator, but also somebody who likes to start negotiating positions with the most leverage that they can possibly get. And that includes, essentially more support for Taiwan. The second, I think it's also mentioned the second Trump presidency is different than the first Trump presidency. And most notably, I think, is COVID. I think we tend to underestimate the amount of distrust that Trump and the Republican Party has in China after COVID, particularly after, I think there's kind of a belief that he might have lost the second election because of COVID impacts, but also that the Chinese government was not forthcoming about the implications when it first first started and was not working with the WHO to be able to get the rest of the world prepared for a pandemic response. And then the third, when I think about this grand bargain that would allow Trump to sign away Taiwan, I can't fathom what China could realistically offer that she would be willing to swallow that would allow such a concession from the US. I mean, that is a huge leverage point. We know that this is a problem for the Chinese government, the US relationship with Taiwan, and, take away all the independent reasons that the US might want to support Taiwan for its own national interest. There's also the sense that this is kind of, the big chip in the pile. And it's very difficult to understand what would she concede for a Trump presidency to be willing to hand over that chip. So that's why I think this question about will Trump bargain away Taiwan is a very unlikely scenario. I do think that there are a lot of outstanding questions that we should be asking. The first is kind of whether the semiconductor and trade deficit imbalances will derail future opportunities. I think this will be a first kind of quote unquote test of Taiwan's commitment is how much they're willing to invest in US chip industry and invest in the United States more generally to kind of balance that trade deficit. I think the second, particularly in Congress, question that is asked again and again on Taiwan is Taiwan's willingness to fight. And that, doesn't necessarily mean a commitment from the Taiwanese government to do this or that, but I think it's a perception of seriousness. That falls into stuff like pre-positioning on the Taiwanese government, explaining to the Taiwanese people, the real threat perceptions, and the threat that Taiwan might face, and of course the defense budget. The third, I would say, is bureaucracy. What we saw was the trend line after the first Trump presidency is a lot of former Trump officials came out and wrote books or went on TV interviews to talk about the fight that they had with their own bureaucracies. So the deeply entrenched civil service in each of the agencies that the Trump presidency will now lead. Whether or not, the candidates that are selected for political appointments in these agencies will have, the bureaucratic knowledge and the staff available to kind of move the bureaucracy in the direction that Trump actually wants to take them. And then the last is what I call distractions. So you saw this obviously with the Biden administration, with the war in Ukraine and the Israel conflicts as well, that other world events do take up a lot of time and attention for leaders of the United States, and whether or not Taiwan would fall to the wayside because there are, trips closer to the boat. The other distraction that I want to pull up for the Trump presidency in particular is domestic polling. This is a administration that cares a lot about representing the American people and ensuring that the American people are behind their policies. So I think the reliance on polling and how it's perceived in the media and the reactions that they're getting from constituents is going to play a very strong role in decision-making on foreign policy as well. Those are my general questions for the group that I'd love to hear our future panelists talk more about. But thank you again and again. Happy to talk about any of these issues in more detail in Q&A.
Excellent. I think that was fantastic. Really, really great overview, as well as, top level trend lines. You really teed up a lot of good, sort of topics for us to, dig into in our conversation. I like how organized it was in terms of outlining what those core interests are that you see in the Trump 2.0 administration: urban share and trade deficit, reshoring U.S. manufacturing, and of course the sort of four questions going forward on semiconductors, Taiwan's willingness to fight the bureaucracy and distractions. I think all of that is going to give us a lot of set the parameters for our discussions going forward, as I've asked the other panelists to kind of dig in some of these subject matter areas, and there probably might be some differences of opinions, and I welcome that. I think that'll be great to sort of think through and assess, sort of how Trump's second administration may approach each of these subset of issues of economics and trade, defense and security, and political and diplomatic issues, and China too. Of course, China is an important factor in this equation as well. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Riley. Riley, over to you.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Yes, Russell asked me to talk more on the economics, trade, and technology, which as an economist, this is the most important thing for everything, right? Because economics is not just a hard math It's also social science. So I want to break down my presentation in two parts. One is just to kind of go over the reality of the economic relationship between the US and Taiwan. And then the second part will be a little bit more on the politics, economy. So to begin, just trend lines, total trend between the United States and Taiwan. We're talking about goods and services, imports plus exports is positive. It's been trading upward. It's slightly lower than it was in 2022 at 152 billion. But it's likely to increase again this year. So we're going to continue to see more trade between the two countries. This doesn't mean it's, of course, America's largest trading partner, but if you go into specific sectors like the semiconductor industry, it is important. Foreign direct investment, of course, does support trade. And if you look at bilateral foreign direct investment stock between the two countries, it's at 100. It's at 41 billion. Again, not the largest, but still significant when you consider strategic investments that companies and governments sort of encourage between each country. One thing we don't normally hear a lot about is US securities. Taiwanese investors own $717 billion worth of US securities. This makes it the 10th largest purchaser of US securities, and 240 of that is in Treasury. So as we have our own domestic debate about the fiscal solvency of our government, it's good to know that Taiwan is the 10th largest owner of that debt. Likewise, it's also the 10th most popular destination for foreign ownership of securities. We have about roughly as much, Americans invest roughly as much in Taiwanese securities as Taiwanese own US treasuries. So much more Taiwanese investment in the United States than American investment in Taiwan. Now, here's the problem. Trade deficit is growing. The fact is, last year, the trade deficit was $51 billion, and that's almost double of what it was in 2021. And it's going to increase this year as well. Exports this year from Taiwan are already up 50%. To the United States. Now, a lot of this is because of the AI boom. So a lot of that is in GPUs and servers. And of course, that helps our own domestic economy, and everyone benefits from that. But the trade hawks in particular might not care. So it will be a challenge going forward. And again, I don't know when that trend is going to reverse at all. Manufacturing does take time, and that doesn't necessarily mean it will change the flow, but it could offset some of the flow. Now, traditionally, we used to have a surplus in services with Taiwan, but that changed in 2021 as well. So that's no longer sort of decreasing that number anymore. That could change this year, but we'll see. It's all sort of a challenge. And to add on to that challenge is, this is kind of the point that I think Anne was getting around is, can the non-trade specific items push back a lot on the problems that trade will cause? And so this isn't a problem just for the government of Taiwan. It's a problem for all governments really right now, specifically the ones that have the largest trade deficits with the United States, which tend to be mostly our partners and allies. I'm talking about Japan, I'm talking about Mexico. China is in there as well, but I think the policy toward China over the next few years will be, I think, significantly different. At least I hope it will be. So the question is, can the discussion around the strategic importance of Taiwan, the discussion around defense spending, this report of a potential new arms package in the Trump administration, can these offset a lot of those issues around the trade deficit? And it was very correct in that Donald Trump has spoken a number of times about how he cares about the trade deficit. That's one of his top three for sure. The additional problem is that question of trade and defense are often separated. Trade lawyers in particular only focus on trade. The question that I'm kind of hitting around often falls within the White House It's people who look more strategically around other issues. But the other issue Taiwan will have is that the Trump administration will likely come to them to ask them to spend more money on defense as well. So the question then is, does the possible defense cooperation, possible arms sales be enough to offset both that ask from the Trump administration on defense spending and on trade deficits? I don't know. It's a challenge. And to talk about sort of the economics of defense spending, because it is an economic issue. Yes, Taiwan is increasing its defense spending. It's not just increasing as a percent of its own GDP, it's increasingly significant. It's increasing significantly over the expenditures it made last year and the year before last, right? It is trending upward, which politically makes it hard for the Lai administration to go back to the LY and ask for even more money, right? So this is going to be a challenge. And the political reality is he is also dealing with a plurality government. I was just in Tokyo last week. They have their own plurality government. They're going to be dealing with a lot of the same issues. The government in South Korea is particularly weak. It's going to be a common theme. And a lot of these countries are going to be asked for more and politically not be able to actually provide more. Another challenge for the Lai administration on the budget side is that the government has relatively little debt compared to a lot of other major economies. It's been running a surplus for the last 7 years, which means it does potentially have a little bit more wiggle room. That's not going to make negotiations any easier for them. Questions that I've kind of hit around, besides the trade specific and defense specific issues, are there any opportunities? And I would say yes. The economic prosperity partnership dialogue, for example, that the United States and Taiwan have, that was launched during the Trump administration, its final year. We have other ongoing economic technology dialogues with Taiwan. Will those continue? Will those survive the Department of Government Efficiency? It's up in the air, but I would like to think they will, especially given, again, the strategic importance of Taiwan. The fact that the EPPD, for example, was driven by the State Department, not the trade USTR, which, again, there oftentimes can be this bifurcation of priorities between the different agencies. Maybe not always a grand strategy. Let's see. One last sort of point on sort of the trade and economic issues is the tariffs on China are coming. Those are going to happen. I think day one, it's going to be Trump's new TPP, right? It's going to be just proclamation. The process will take time, but I think the intent is there. That's going to be really challenging for a lot of Taiwanese and American companies that have business operations within both Taiwan and China. China is, has a lot of Taiwanese investment in it. It has a lot of American investment in it as well. And the semiconductor supply chain is the most globally diverse supply chain, and it will feel the effects of that. So that's probably the largest. The second unknown, really, though, is the global tariff that has been kicked around. This idea that the United States will impose 10% or 20% tariff on all imports. That one's a little bit more questionable about not just the rate, but the legislation he might use, the process it could take. Will there be exemptions for companies or countries, and whether Congress will actually allow him to continue to sort of take trade authority out of the Congress. So that one's a little bit up in the air, but and of course, if there's other trade laws he uses for other trade measures, like Section 301, Section 232, if you're familiar with those terms, it's trade authorities he used in his first administration to raise tariffs. The challenge then still is that there are globally diverse Taiwanese companies, there are globally diverse American companies that operate in Vietnam, in Japan, in Mexico, that if those countries do see tariffs, that'll still slightly increase the cost of those companies with consumers. So A bit of mix. I think there's going to be a lot of challenges. A lot of it's going to be political. A lot of voices are going into the Trump administration. Some who are very much trade hawks, who are just pure trade all the time, and those definitely have a sway with Trump himself. But then there are some of the more, I think, geostrategic, maybe the Rubio types who look a little bit broader than just trade, that might be able to offset some of that and understand that there are exemptions to be made to some of these issues. It's questionable how much that will get us, and then but the opportunities are there. I think the EPPD, for example, that's a strong. I think that's a commitment that has continued under the Biden administration, and it talks on a lot of the non-trade specific technical items like technology, like energy security. It could easily be expanded into a whole slew of things that align perfectly with whatever Trump's strategic priorities will be in this next administration. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Riley. Those a lot of good points that you made there. I think one observation that stood out in particular was also the point that you made that lots of the problems and challenges that you foresee Taiwan facing in a Trump 2.0 is actually not necessarily unique to Taiwan. This is part of the broader strategic logic of Trump that's going to be applied across the board to with allies and partners. And so Taiwan will be navigating these challenges alongside with many other countries too, as well in facing these challenges. I think to give credit to the Biden administration where credit is really certainly due is on the economic and trade front, though. I think the Biden administration in the last 4 years has really moved the ball forward in ways that we just didn't see in the first Trump administration, right? The TIFA, resuming the TIFA talks, the US-Taiwan 21st Century Trade Agreement, the first phase of those agreements, also initiating in the final stages of in the last month, initiation of talk about the avoidance of double taxation agreement between the United States and Taiwan. Now, Annie teed up the fact that she suggested this could continue in the Trump administration, but I wonder, and I want to tee this up for you, Riley, whether that is actually viable in a Trump 2.0 administration, just given the laser focus that the first Trump administration had on just the trade war with China, tariffs, and really there wasn't a lot of breathing space on Taiwan trade and economic issues during that first administration. So a lot of these good things that we saw in the Biden administration, I want to tee this up for you to think about and talk about in the Q&A is whether that's survivable in a Trump 2.0. All right, so Riley talked about the defense economics. I'm going to turn it over now to Mike to talk about the defense and security elements of the Trump 2.0 administration. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. Thanks to GTI. Good to be on a panel with old friends and colleagues here today. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the context in which President Trump will be entering office, and then talk through some of the opportunities for Taiwan as well as some of the risks when it comes to the US-Taiwan security and defense relationship. So first, context. Last year, when Xi Jinping was in Moscow, he told Vladimir Putin that we are seeing changes unseen in 100 years, and together we, China and Russia, are driving those changes. And I think we're going to see some of those changes begin to come into fruition during this next Trump presidency. Among these will be the so-called Davidson window closing or opening. So the Davidson window back in 2001, Senate Armed Services hearing, the former commander of Indo-Pacific Command said he thought the threat to Taiwan would be made manifest, the Chinese threat to Taiwan, within 6 years. That's 2027. A couple of years later, Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, essentially confirmed that assessment in a public setting, saying that Xi Jinping had directed the PLA to be ready to invade by 2027. This is not a deadline by which to invade. It's important to be clear about that. As far as we know, Xi Jinping hasn't marked January 1st, 2027 as the day on which the PLA gets the order to go. But he has set this as a deadline by which he wants the PLA to have the capabilities in order to do that. that will change reality in important ways for Taiwan, right? So it will, again, if the PLA achieves this, and there's question about whether it will by 2027, but let's assume it does. That's just 2 years from now. And that will open doors for China, for Xi Jinping, that have long been closed. It doesn't mean that use of force is inevitable. It does mean that Beijing will have more viable options for moving up the escalation ladder. If it does so, that will be less likely to back down during an escalating crisis, and that ultimately Xi Jinping may be more tempted to settle the cross-strait dispute once and for all. So I would argue that Taiwan should spend the next couple of years really focused on preparing for this shift. And as I said, I think a new Trump presidency will offer opportunities for Taiwan to do so. So first, I think we will see again a more normal, though not diplomatically normalized, bilateral U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So during his prior term, President Trump, his senior team, did not feel bound by the strictures which had long restrained U.S.-Taiwan relations. I would argue they didn't look at the one China policy, for example, as limiting the kinds of activities they could engage in the way that previous administrations had. You recall during the closing days of the administration, the Trump administration in 2021, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo rescinded the Taiwan contact guidelines, which are guidelines under which govern the way U.S. government officials and military members across government can engage with their Taiwan counterparts. Secretary Blinken reimposed those. If Senator Rubio is confirmed, I think it's reasonable to expect that he may again rescind them or loosen them. And all of this, I would argue, is to the good because it allows, again, for the sort of more normal, more regular contact engagement between officials in both Washington and Taipei at all levels. So this was another thing we saw during the first Trump administration, which Russell pointed to, that we saw more senior engagement. We saw more senior officials than had gone in some time from the Defense Department, Secretary from the State Department traveling to Taiwan. This is important. I think there is an opportunity to see that sort of high level, more regular engagement again. This is beneficial for diplomatic reasons, but for security reasons as well. So in-person meeting, again, especially between those senior ranking officials, do have practical import. There is a symbolic value in that they signal to China and to others U.S. commitment to the relationship. But these kind of meetings are useful in mobilizing bureaucracies. Bureaucracies have to prepare senior officials to engage in those meetings and then follow up on the do-outs that come out of them. It's also important that leaders get to know one another on a personal level, I would argue. So, and American men and women may one day be called upon to go into harm's way on behalf of Taiwan's independence. And under such circumstances, I would argue that sacrifices can be minimized, success made more likely if senior U.S. and Taiwan officials are already in the habit of engaging with one another. If they already understand the way one another think, if they have well-established communication, that will all help in the event of a crisis. Demonstrating those ties contributes to deterring Chinese aggression. So if Beijing sees the United States and Taiwan as awkward partners, right, as you might argue we are, in that we don't have official government relations and we do have these pictures on the way we engage. If China sees the United States and Taiwan as awkward partners, it may think it is more easily able to pick us apart. If instead it looks at the U.S.-Taiwan relationship as more of a cohesive unit, I think that sends an important deterrent signal to Xi Jinping. And while that cohesiveness can start at the top, it is important for both countries to invest in it at the operational level as well. And here I'm thinking about the military relationship in particular. This began to to reach new levels during the first Trump term. So it was in October of 2021 that the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. Special Operations units and a Marine Corps contingent had been in Taiwan for at least a year, training their counterparts. We've seen that training relationship continue to evolve under the Biden administration. And I think there's reason to expect it will continue to evolve going forward. And again, I would argue that it's important that that happen at both senior levels and sort of, lower operational levels, right? Flag officers, their staffs in both countries should be engaged in combined contingency planning, discussions about roles and responsibilities. And US and Taiwanese forces should be training with each other regularly at sea, on the ground, in the air. And again, this is happening more and more. I think the Trump administration provides opportunities for that to continue. We've heard a little bit about arms sales, so there's opportunities here as well. I think Taiwan understands well that arms sales are, one of the key ways to President Trump's heart. So the Financial Times reported Taiwan is putting together a big request, which may include F-35s, advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft, Aegis destroyers. I don't know that all that comes to fruition, but the point here is that Taiwan is going to get, I think, maybe not everything it wants, but a lot of what it wants. And done wisely, those kinds of investments can have important effects. Again, there is a symbolic issue here. There is a symbolic show of U.S. commitment. These kinds of sales impose a political cost on China for their pressure, but also perhaps can serve, as Riley was discussing, to take some of the edge off of the imbalances in the economic trade relationship. And of course, those kinds of investments and capabilities enhance Taiwan's self-defense capability, and can do so at a time when, again, the PLA is marching towards this 2027 date. Very quickly on risks, and he has pointed to the sorts of comments that President Trump has made over the years. As we know from John Bolton, comparing Taiwan to the point of a pen and China to his desk in the Oval Office. President Trump makes frequent comments about how far Taiwan is from the United States and how close it is to China. He is kind of implied that Taiwan's very rich. It really shouldn't need the U.S. to defend it. And he's implied that defense against China is impossible. So none of that should inspire confidence in Taiwan. It seems to me that it's not clear that the president thinks about China and Taiwan in fundamentally different terms. When he talks about the way Taiwan has, stolen the chimp industry, he talks about China in very similar ways. That both of these countries have taken advantage of stupid leaders here in order to pursue their own economic ends. I don't think there's much evidence that President Trump thinks about Taiwan through a strategic lens, and that's troubling. But to me, the biggest question pertaining to this next presidency and what it will mean for his personal interest in the Taiwan question is what he wants from China. So during the first go round, we knew from early on, or probably before he even came into office, that he was focused like a laser beam on getting a trade deal to address the trade deficit. And he eventually got one. The phase one deal in January 2020 obviously got that process got set by COVID. If he is interested in that sort of deal again, if that's what's driving him, then that doesn't bode well for Taiwan. In that it will leave him susceptible to trading away, not the relationship as a whole, but aspects of it that China finds troubling. If, on the other hand, he has embraced the idea of China as a strategic competitor, which of course his administration popularized in the first place, if he thinks about waging a long-term competition and he wants to win it, then I think that does bode well for the relationship. Again, I think we can be cautiously optimistic about the opportunities that will be there in a second term. Thanks, Russ.
Mike, excellent. Great insights there. You led off with the geopolitical context of what the Trump 2.0 administration will be entering into. And there's perhaps no other greater geopolitical crises going on right now than over Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm sure all of us on this panel have been following to a great degree, that the debate over Ukraine and support for Ukraine is sometimes now uncomfortably leading over to Taiwan issues. And I wonder, and then please challenge my my premise if you think it's wrong. But what are, I'm teeing this up at some point that I would like for you to address in discussions going forward, but what do you think then is the impact of the ongoing debate over Ukraine and the resolution of that conflict have for Taiwan, and how this, in particular, the Trump 2.0 administration might address the Taiwan issue in its approach? Talking a lot about China, and then as part of all our, I think everyone's discussion here, China is part of that conversation, and China's going to have a say, no matter whether we like it or not. And so, yeah, prefer not, yeah. But so Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of give us a reading of your reading as to, how China is assessing the situation right now.
Excellent. So my fellow panelists talked about the political, economic, and military aspects, implications for Taiwan. I'm going to try to do the same for China all in my one session. So the party is likely undergoing a net assessment right now of the relative positions of PRC and the US. As Russell mentioned, the Trump of 2024 is not like the Trump of 2016. Similarly, the China of 2024 is not like the China of 2016. Right. So they're conducting this net assessment of how highly China ranks on various aspects compared to the US. And very helpfully, back in 2020, the party theorists came up with a formula for how they assess what they call comprehensive national power. Right, so it's hard power, which is a combination of military, economic, and scientific development, squared with an assessment of internal turmoil, multiplied by soft power, and then multiplied by what they call smart power, or just general government competence. Right, but they've made it very clear that the key variable here is their assessment of hard power. So let's take a look at what's going on in the last 4 years for China and how they perceive themselves. So first, economics. There's been a significant shift in domestic perceptions over China's strength. Right. Back in 2021, where this idea of the Davidson window came out, China was still riding on a relative high. Its property market had just hit all-time highs in 2021. Since then, their property market has imploded. It actually imploded right in the middle of 2021 with the fall of Evergrande. Right. And then since then, growth has been pretty abysmal for China. Right. In the third quarter of 2023, the US actually had the same percentage of GDP growth as China did, and the US has a far larger economy to begin with. So domestically, what this has meant is a huge expansion of local provincial debt. This debt was largely driven by COVID and the severe lockdown, the testing, the responses. And then after that, when the whole lockdown situation melted away due to the protests and COVID exploded in China, local provincial debt got far worse. That also meant in turn that local provinces had to depend even more on the booming property market as sources of their funds. So when the property market itself collapsed, this bled over very, very badly into the local provincial bottom line. So she has an ecological hatred against bailing out either the property companies or the local provinces. But that also meant financial trouble as the local government started to lean more heavily on the banks. And it was only this year when it looked like there was going to be a financial and a real estate crisis that she was compelled to act. So this year, there's been quantitative easing by Xi. This year, first announcement of stimulus by Xi, and also a debt swap where the central government is taking more and more of the debts of the provincial governments. I should note here that this debt swap is a drop in the bucket. It is about 10 trillion RMB, which is about $1.4 trillion. But right now, estimates of where the local provincial debt was in 2023 was 60 trillion RMB. So it's pretty clear that she is holding a lot of this powder dry in case there is a trade war with the United States. This has also meant that the PRC has leaned much more heavily on its exports, and that's angered the rest of the world, the EU in particular. But now with Trump, of course, this will also come under fire. So right now, the one expanding portion of the Chinese economy will likely come under heavy attack, and this is a heavy concern sheet. Second, scientific development. Right now, this is one of the focus areas for Xi because he's considered it part of his what he calls the new quality productive forces. This is a place where he's emphasized putting Chinese money into instead of trying to bail out the real estate market. But I think what he's also seen over the last few years is some shocks. He's highlighted three core technologies as part of his new quality productive forces. That is AI, batteries, and commercial space industry. In 2023, the Chinese were shocked by ChatGPT, and they were considerably surprised by how far along the US AI industry was compared to the Chinese. They thought that they were about on the verge of catching up to the US. And then later on, after ChatGPT came out, their internal assessment was that the US was about 1 to 2 years ahead. And that gap hasn't closed since then, despite a significant government funding. US private investment in tech still outnumbers the Chinese by an order of 10 to 1, even with the government investment by China. Commercial space industry. SpaceX has similarly knocked off the Chinese development in space tech. In about 2015, when the Chinese first started pushing into space, they assessed themselves as around a decade behind the United States. Now what we've seen in the recent Zhuhai Air Show is that they come out with their version of Starship called Long March 9. And they expect Long March 9 to launch in 2033. So their Starship one will not launch until then. So it shows that the gap has not changed despite huge government investment in this sector as well. And then finally, when you're talking about the last one, batteries, this is the one area where China is indisputably ahead. They have pretty much a monopoly over the lithium-ion market right now. But even then, China is extremely nervous because they're afraid the next generation of battery technology, solid state or semi-solid state batteries, may be able to leapfrog their entire supply chain that they spent the last 15 years in developing. So again, scientific development, they feel themselves to be behind. And then finally, the big dog in the room on military power. The PLA has continued to get lavish funding from the central government, but the war in Ukraine has been a very sobering lesson for them. They saw how overwhelming Russian air power, a long-range strike in artillery could not win the war in 3 days or in day 1,000 as it was yesterday. The Russians were forced to move from a strategy of precision paralyzing strikes followed by thunder run on the capital, which sounds familiar to anybody thinking about how the PLA is planning to do things with Taiwan, to full-on attrition warfare, include things with complete with World War II style punishment battalions and blocking forces that gun down their own retreating soldiers. So I don't think it's an accident or a coincidence that the party has repeatedly purged the PLA rocket force over the last 2 years. So what does this mean for Taiwan? We've already seen some of the messaging from Beijing. She just recently talked to President Biden, talked about his 4 red lines, but in reality, these 4 red lines are meant as a message for President-elect Trump. He talked about these red lines as Taiwan, democracy and human rights, China's path system, and its current its rights to development. And I think we can think of these as defensive red lines in nature. Indicative of Xi's desire to start imposing public costs on Trump before Trump even gets into power. So what we're going to see here then is that he's not likely to directly challenge the US, not when he feels like China is in a relative position of weakness, at least in the short to medium term. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all good for Taiwan, because under the concept of killing the chicken scare the monkeys, he will likely press on his regional neighbors all the more to try to show that China is not as weak as people think it might be. So I can see some opportunities and the dangers for Taiwan. Right? Taiwan can be fairly confident that in the short term, there may not be an all-out invasion. But on the other hand, the idea of blockade or quarantine suddenly becomes much more worrisome. So we can take a look at the idea of Taiwan being able to look at its defense in terms of being able to flexibly transition from both a blockade quarantine scenario, gray zone warfare, to that of an all-out invasion. And that's something that the Taiwanese have had difficulty with in the past. On the other hand, there are also enormous opportunities for Taiwan as well, because China will now look closely at isolating Taiwan and trying to avoid a direct war with the US. Conversely, it will also be Taiwan's benefit to expand its ties more closely with the US and to extend its unofficial partnerships worldwide. And I think these are going to be some of the main opportunities that Taiwan can see to be able to capitalize on this period of PRC going forward.
Fantastic, Eric. Now we're going to enter the moderated discussion portion of today's discussion. And I just want to remind all our viewers here in the audience as well as online that we do want to hear from you. As a reminder, we'll reserve around 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the session, starting around 1:10-ish. To take those questions. I see that we have already received a few questions from our online audience we'll try to get to as well. And Eric, that was really excellent. And I think you sort of concluded where I wanted to pick up on in terms of the net assessment there, China's own net assessment. And I wanted to get your net assessment, as to, whether the sort of the headwinds that you are referencing in how China sees its own constraints in national power, and combine that with what we can, sort of glean from or expect from a Trump 2.0 administration, both in the economic and the defense and security side, and what that means for how China might approach Taiwan, right? Issues related to Taiwan. And related to this, of course, is, in all the lessons that the world is drawing from Ukraine, the war over Ukraine, what is, you wrote a piece for us actually on this topic very early on in the conflict. I think it was actually the month of when the conflict broke out. And I wonder, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you see right now, 2 years, 1,000 days now, just past 1,000 days of that conflict, what you think the PLA has really drawn, or Xi Jinping actually more precisely, has drawn from that conflict and its application to Taiwan. So, just again, teeing that up in terms of a question I'd like for us to explore a bit. But before we do that, I want to pose a few questions to the group while I have you to exercise my moderator's prerogative here. And this is a group question for all of you. So the first of which, of course, is directly relevant to the election, the U.S. election, as well as the personnels that the president-elect has already announced that he intends to nominate. And Annie had discussed some of these nominees to include, of course, Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Representative Mike Waltz as the National Security Advisor, John Ratcliffe as the Director of CIA, and Pete Haggis as the Secretary of Defense, and a number of these, positions as well. And I want to get the group's take as to how you see these potential nominees, because they still have to be confirmed, right? Let's remember that also as well. What implications they might have for Taiwan policy, given just also how important we saw the personnel was in the first administration of the Trump administration for its approach to Taiwan policy. Any takers in terms of wanting to lead off on some of these nominees and what that might mean for Taiwan policy in the second Trump administration? No, I think it's.
I think, Senator Rubio has a very long track record of being a China hawk and being very supportive of the US-Taiwan relationship. Representative Waltz has similar record, So I think from a Taiwan policy perspective, those are reassuring names. The rest of.
That's right.
To me, the maybe not the more important question, but an equally important question is who the sub-cabinet appointees are going to be, right? So are we going to have people like Randy Schreiber and Matt Pottinger and Matt Turner, people who were driving Taiwan policy, China policy during that first term. And we just, I mean, I don't have much of a sense yet of who those folks are going to be. I think that will give us a lot of clarity about what Taiwan policy will look like, or at least what sort of the contours of the internal fight will look like.
In addition to the sub-cabinet, I think Riley, brought up kind of the tension between the national security folks and the traditional trade dynamics. I think it's telling that there's still an open question as to who's going to take over Treasury and USTR. There's the announcement of Howard Lutnick, who said in the announcement, it says including oversight over USTR, including something over USTR. So, but until we really have more clarity on who's going to hold those really important positions, I think Riley's question about, well, is it going to be a trade focused, dominant voice in the Trump administration, or is it going to be a national security geopolitically focused voice in the administration? We really don't know yet.
I'm also curious too about what the key buzzwords are going to be, right? With the Biden administration, the idea of this being responsible competition, that was a key buzzword that everybody had to work under. Now, I've heard, the debate, is this still a competition or is this a full-on adversarial Cold War? Right, until we figure out what that new buzzword is going to be, it's hard for me to tell the policy implications.
Very diplomatic answers from this. Yeah, that's fine. All right, Annie, let me stick with you though. Maybe where we have a bit more clarity here, rather than Trump's administration and his cabinet and where that might lead, policy. Let's stick with Congress, and then. So you mentioned in your comments, and I agree with you that congressional, oversight activism on Taiwan policy really helped drove a lot of how, well, initially, the first Trump administration, and whether or not you expect to see that this time around in a Trump 2.0 in the 119th Congress, just given the fact that some of the folks that you have mentioned and also did not mention aren't not going to be in those positions anymore in Congress, namely, of course, Senator Rubio, but there are others, that have left, Senator Cory Gardner, for instance, or Representative Mike Gallagher, and Dana Rohrabacher and others who have been really pro-Taiwan, really driving changes or driving activism in Congress. So do you expect to see that? And why? Why do you expect to see that in a if you do see so in Congress and what it might do in a Trump 2.0?
Like I mentioned in my remarks, I don't see Congress planning to give too much executive. One, because separate branch of government, Congress has always done that. I think two, I mentioned you do have a couple of strong Taiwan voices that are going into the administration. But that doesn't mean that Congress doesn't have strong Taiwan voices still there, or even strong voices on competition with China. You still have Senators Cornyn and Thune on the side. You still have Biden and Bali as well. On the House side, you still have Representative Barr, who's been very pro sanctions on the PRC and very pro Taiwan. You have French Hill, on services. Some of the Wagner, Representative Isa on House Affairs, and there's also very strong Taiwan voices and competition with China voices. So even, it might not be that you're losing that voice, it's just you have different voices and opportunities for different voices to rise now. I think also if you look at, Senate Speaker Johnson is a very shrewd politician who has close ties to the Trump world. So, he would be probably working very closely, but, again, not wanting to give up too much Article 2 power. we have a new Senate leadership too, Senator Thune. And first thing, when you take over new leadership, the last thing you want to do when you take over new leadership is cede some of your power away. So I still see the Senate being very strongly, you're the Senate and we have a role in foreign policy.
Can I ask any about,
So with Republican control of Congress, do you think there's sort of Taiwan relevant legislation out there that gets done that maybe would not have gotten done in the past couple years in divided government?
I think we'll see more implementing legislation on some of the authorizations that we. This kind of takes the urgency away from Trump's administration to have to do everything in the first 100 days by executive order, and then work with Congress to legislate it. It's law.
with Senator Rubio now going as the nominee for Secretary of State, I'm reminded also of the legislation that he had put forward in 2023, co-authored with a Democratic colleague there. And I think it does sort of suggest to some degree how this administration, at least in the at least the State Department, may approach Taiwan issues that I think is reassuring, perhaps for friends in Taiwan concerning Taiwan's place in the international community. And this is the Taiwan Relations Reinforcement Act. This bill, in addition to a number of other provisions, would create an interagency Taiwan Policy Task Force, elevate the U.S. representative to Taiwan to a Senate confirmed position, establish the U.S.-Taiwan Cultural Exchange Foundation, require counting and report of the Taiwan Travel Act, right, which is an important provision that has sort of authorized, would legislatively or authorized high-level, contact exchanges with Taiwan, among other of these provisions, some of which I think actually were just taken out of the Taiwan Policy Act, given the political sensitivity that was seen on the Hill, given some of the political provisions in there, and then putting it as a standalone marker for potential action to go forward. And I think Senator Rubio, potentially on the helm of the State Department, there is a potentially a very positive thing for supporters of a more robust U.S.-Taiwan relationship there. Okay, so next, I want to return to the question that I posed earlier to Riley, and this relates to the viability of some of the economic and trade actions taken by the Biden administration, and whether you assess this is likely to be survivable in a Trump 2.0. Just given the disparity, I think that is readily observable in the number of sort of initiative taken under the Biden administration versus the first Trump administration.
Difficult question. As you were saying earlier, Trump 1.0 does allow us some sort of insight into the direction of Trump 2.0, but Trump 2.0 will be markedly different. We just don't know how, right? So that's the question. If we look back at the first Trump administration, the deal with China, as Mike was talking about earlier, was sort of the goal. It was to have this trade agreement with China to either offset the trade deficit or deal with theft issues or quite a number of issues that the United States has with China. And so in that process, the discussions with Taiwan were just shelved. We didn't have any of the trade or investment framework agreement dialogues. The conversation around trade wasn't even sort of, there was no discussion around any kind of trade discussions with Taiwan in order to prioritize discussions with China. How is this different this time? As Mike was saying, the trade agreement that we have with China was signed 1 month before COVID. There's a lot, I think, who are going into Trump's cabinet who are still very upset about COVID and feel that China has not paid well enough for the damage that it's unleashed on the world. The phase 1 agreement itself has not been actually realized. And so I think that's actually going to build much of the foundation for the new tariffs as well. So Trump himself could have a grudge to pick. are going to pick with the Chinese and want them to pay for a while. The question then, though, is does that include dealing with Taiwanese to sort of piss off Beijing? I don't know. Again, the trade deficit with Taiwan is growing. Who knows what necessarily will survive the Department of Government Efficiency run by Musk and Ramaswamy. It's up in the air. The 21st Century Trade Initiative, for example, it could go either way, honestly. On the one hand, it could be seen in the same context as TIFA, as it essentially is the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement right now. There's really hardly any efforts on TIFA. It's all in the 21st Century Trade. But on the flip side of that, the 21st Century Trade Initiative is essentially being processed as if it were a free trade agreement. Congress has oversight of the negotiations as they are currently. In fact, if Trump wanted to push it over the edge, all he'd have to do is just blow on it and he could have a free trade agreement with Taiwan next year, probably. He has the full majority of Congress. The agreement's already basically there. Their issue, the trade deficit, that's not going to get fixed. But the issue of tariffs, they're already very low already, so it's not really that much of a give on either side. So who knows? Yeah.
Case to watch right there. Mike, over to you. I want to turn back to the question that I posed to you at the end of your opening comments, and really just what you see in terms of the impact of Ukraine, for Taiwan policy going forward in a Trump 2.0 administration.
There's a few things to consider here. I mean, first, I would just say, like President Trump has said repeatedly, he's going to solve this in 24 hours. First of all, I don't think he really believes that. But I think he will find this is far more complicated than he and some of his team think. The Ukrainians obviously get a vote. Our NATO allies get a vote, and this may be more difficult to unwind again than the president is expecting it to be. That being said, if we do withdraw somehow, force a peace treaty, or even if we don't force a peace treaty, we just withdraw our support and move on. Look, there's two ways to look at that. It's from Taiwan's perspective, from allies in Asia. They could find it reassuring if the argument is, we really are concerned about China's rise and the way China's behaving, and we need to focus more narrowly on challenges in Asia. And that's why we're backing away from the involvement in the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, it could stoke significant concern among our Asian allies, who will see a United States which doesn't abide by its commitments, which is fickle, which is perhaps willing to push partners to negotiate away their territory. I can tell you what I'm hearing from people in the region is all of the latter and none of the former. I think the sort of reassurance argument is a logical argument to make, but it doesn't seem to me to jive with the reality way that many Asian countries are thinking about this. Now, part of the reason is because the way the axis of authoritarians, axis of disorder, choose your favorite term, has evolved over the past 2 years, right? So now we have Russia and North Korea reviving their mutual defense treaty. Obviously, North Korean troops now in Russia at relatively low numbers right now, but that number could grow. I think it's really made plain argument, which had been more theoretical, in February 2022, which is that Asia and Europe are not strategically distinct regions, that they're intimately tied together. And again, I think that reality has been made more clear as the war has dragged on. There's a third concern, which is, I think, for some Republicans, not all, not even most, the argument that we should withdraw our support for Ukraine to focus on China is instrumental rather than sincerely held. again, for the most part, I think that is a sincere argument, but I think for elements of the sort of the right wing of the party, which are skeptical of foreign engagement, if we were to follow this course, it wouldn't be long before there were arguments about focusing more on home than on China. So I think there are significant implications for what happens in Ukraine for Taiwan and our other Asian partners.
Yeah, I'll inject to your side. Much of this depends on how, of course, the war in Ukraine goes in 2025 and how the contours of that war go without the potential US assistance, right? Whether or not the amount of aid that we're now rushing into Ukraine, the authorities that would allowing Ukraine to be able to strike Russia, whether the NATO and the EU can provide enough of a backstop to allow Ukraine to form a credible defense. That'll really determine, how contours will work. Because I think it's important to mention that, Russia is not an unstoppable steamroller, that they're using a lot of their reserves, knowing full well that, maybe if Harris had won, then they would be out of shots, right? So Russia is pushing all out right now, so we can't assume that Ukraine would necessarily fall in 2025, even without this assistance.
Please, yeah.
I think these are fantastic points, but I think domestically, politically, the number one lesson that we took from Ukraine is how our defense industry is complete shambles, right? We now have a whole the new industrial defense strategy because of how shambolic we realized that not only our procurement processes were, which people have been talking about for decades, but also our actual manufacturing base is pretty weak and slow and burdensome. And I think that has driven a lot of the conversation about the need to either prioritize, our geopolitical interests, essentially, to ensure that we're not over-promising our allies. But it's also a question that you have an administration that's already predisposed to, really want to focus on US manufacturing. And now you have a very logical argument that's being made that the US cannot be the arsenal of democracy unless it has a very strong manufacturing base, and we don't have a strong manufacturing base. So I just want to say that, if we're looking at lessons from Ukraine, yes, other folks are taking lessons from Ukraine about, war posturing and what they should be looking into, but the US also has a very strong lesson to learn from Ukraine as well, in terms of our own defense industrial base. And a lot of the questions that we have about geopolitically, ideologically, what we would like to do and engage in. The other, question is like realistically, what do we have the capacity to do, and should realistically where our processes and resources are going into building that capacity to be able to meet our ideological goals.
Assessment there. Okay, I'm a man of my word, so even though I have so many more questions that I want to pose to our panelists, I am going to open it up for our audience here as well as online. I'm going to take a little turn in terms of taking in person and then going to online, but I'll try to get as much questions in as we can. So why don't we take one sweep of three for this initial in person. So this gentleman here, this lady right here. Okay.
Tom Davey, US Navy, now retired. Two quick, hopefully not interrelated questions. First one, nobody mentioned hypersonics, which as a naval officer is important to me. And secondly, the Davidson window opens second half of Trump 2.0. Happens if they exercise they open the window themselves, they come to the window.
Okay, Garrett?
Garrett Van der Wees, teaching Taiwan history at George Mason. Question for Riley. You talked about the 60% tariffs that would be imposed and the negative effect it would have on Taiwan. It will be a challenge for Taiwanese companies. That's on the one hand true because of their supply chains going all the way in China. On the other hand, isn't it also true that you see much more reshoring, homeshoring, and diversification?
Following up with two issues about what you guys put on Congress.
Could you state your name and affiliation?
Oh, sorry, I'm Dr. Irene Gonzalez. I am Chief Business Officer of CIFAI. It's a consulting firm in artificial intelligence, private sector. Yes, following up with discussion of about Ukraine. My question is, is a strong force now in the soon-to-be vice president of Trump, Mr. Vance. And he has already said that he has already pledged written and given to Trump about completely stopping, asking Ukraine to completely give up its territory. Finish. This is a question that I asked, how much strength that man has based on what they say versus action. And the second one is that whatever you say, you gave a lot of currently to the new Congress that's coming, but remember, that Trump owns the Republican Party. How much of that they really going to have now, especially the Senate, the power of decide, no, we have to confirm what you pick up for your cabinet. No, we have to follow the rule of law or the laws of Congress to be able to do this or that. So I see conflict on that based on what Trump said, even if he said a lot of things that he will not do. However, he has the power and he owns the Republican Party. So what do you think is going to happen?
Okay, so we have questions about hypersonics, the Davidson window, and kind of, coming up to the window. Reshoring, talk about personnel, but we didn't talk about, of course, the vice president-elect, J.D. Vance, and his views and what that might mean. And also the future separation of powers under
Yes.
Trump 2.0. I'm going to pose this to the panel. You can pick and choose whichever question you would like to address. And so just please go ahead.
I feel like those two might be more connected, so I can kind of get this out of the way and let the rest of the panel do the work. Yeah, so the debate around tariffs and the effect that it has on foreign direct investment, reshoring, manufacturing. Yes and no. Yes, it does, I think, have some effect in drawing manufacturing out of China, but so does China's own domestic political economy right now. The economy itself is in shambles. The political situation is dire for foreign investors. So it's hard to say, like, for example, the degree to which tariffs are shifting FDI out of China. But yes, they do have that effect. The challenge for Taiwan, and this will lead into this next question, is private companies themselves are all thinking about Taiwan contingency now. And they're looking at the Davidson window about whether they should actually be investing more in Taiwan as they're looking outside of China or not. And so for Taiwan's own domestic economy, that's a challenge. I think it's challenging to pull in foreign direct investment much more than it, for example, say going to Southeast Asia and Mexico, which again, the macro economy of all these of the world, actually, Taiwan is not always that competitive when it comes to capital and labor costs. So, yes and no.
Okay.
Mike,
Yeah, I guess I'll touch upon a couple things. So I think, sir, your second question was essentially what if China invades in 2027? I guess I would say a couple things. One is, as I kind of hinted at in my initial remarks, I am skeptical that the PLA achieves that 2027 goal. I think these really significant purges of senior officers over the last couple of years suggest that they are not advancing at the pace that they might hope. I don't think their non-strategic nuclear forces or their strategic nuclear forces will be at a state at which they will be comfortable invading at that point. I think China sees that as a key enabler. There's still questions about how realistic their training is, et cetera. Even if they do assess that they've achieved, checked off whatever internal, check boxes they need to check to meet that goal, it will remain a highly risky endeavor, both for military and political reasons. And to my mind, obviously we can't read the future, but 2 years from now, is Xi Jinping going to be in a situation in which he feels he needs to accept those really very high levels of risk? And I'm skeptical. On Trump and owning the GOP in Congress, and Annie, maybe you have more to say about this. I'll just say that Trump, as soon as he takes the oath of office, will be a lame duck, and I don't know how long he sort of owns the GOP. His the political futures won't be tied to him in the way that they have been for the last 8 years. And I think Annie's right, that Congress tends to be defensive of his prerogative.
Okay, Annie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On 2027, I think the other thing, in addition to the doubts that Mike raised that I think are true, is also like she has a lot of leverage by threatening to invade. Once he invades, he loses leverage. Now he's in it, and that's a very different position for him too. So unless there is that window of necessity that comes in where he feels like he must, I do think that, he'll want to try to keep his leverage for as long as possible. For Congress, and I think, not parliamentary system, technically, Trump does not own Congress. And congressmen, we used to joke in the Senate that the Senate is 100 little presidents, and that's true, right? You have 100 little senators that really believe that they could be president one day. And no one's going to, kind of kowtow to the current president and ruin their future chances. But also, I think Congress is set up in a way to resist executive branch pressure to the best of its ability to be able to be a balance. And we see opportunities in the Trump administration where Congress did so, right? Like some of the cabinet appointments were really slow rolled until they had to make someone new. We saw opportunities where Trump announced something and were scrambled to stop it. For example, when Trump in his first presidency talked about withdrawing troops from South Korea, Congress really got up in a tizzy and put in a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to be able to do so, so that it ultimately wasn't possible to withdraw. We also see every single legislative cycle, Congress puts a lot of limitations on appropriations, earmarks, on NDAA authorizations, how long these are authorized, and so on. And there's almost everything that the administration announces, Congress automatically says that it needs implementing legislation and writes into law that they must have oversight over. So I think all of this point to a Congress that's not going to, go quiet into the night. Yeah.
I'll address the one word question about hypersonics. So yes, hypersonics, we've seen Putin use them in Ukraine. We've seen actually him use it repeatedly in Ukraine. You've seen him use long range strike missiles in Ukraine that are not necessarily hypersonics. He's shot thousands of them into Ukraine. He's done them in big salvos and small salvos against cities, against military targets, against electric stations. And as far as I can see, it has had no effect whatsoever on Ukrainian ability to resist. So again, this is probably half the reason why she's now purging the PLA rocket force like no tomorrow. Like, if this is the one big weapon that you are using to threaten US intervention and you see that feeling so miserable in Ukraine, what does that say about your standing?
I do want to get to at least one question from our online audience, and this will probably bring us to a close. And I apologize to our in-house audience. I think some of our speakers will be sticking around, after the session to take further conversations and questions. But this question comes, so I'm going to close out with Reinhard Bütikofer. He's a former member of the European Parliament. He also happens to be an advisor to GTI as well. And his question is, and this is for the entire panel, what contribution to a deterrence policy against China's aggressive measures and steps towards Taiwan will the Trump 2.0 administration expect from allies, in particular from Europe? Akers.
I think the most substantive way that Europe can contribute to deterring China is with a threat of economic repercussions. But to the extent that the UK and France in particular, and perhaps others can, offer to contribute some military forces in the event of a crisis, that's great. But that's always going to be marginal given the distance and the sizes of their militaries. But if Europe is able to, again, credibly signal that it will respond to invasion with, again, really severe economic repercussions, I think that's enormously helpful. Whether Europe can pull itself together to do that, I'm a little skeptical.
Akers.
From what we've seen from the Trump world, national security folks, I think the expectation is Europe must be able to figure out and defend Europe by itself. and let the US deter China credibly. So instead of, say, for instance, Germany sending naval ships into the Taiwan Strait to be able to ramp up their support instead for Ukraine and make that solely a European call. So you can see the differing ideas that they would have for now compared to in the Biden administration.
Anything from any
I
of
think
them?
the other two that I would add, ones that Mike and Eric brought up, is aligning on export controls to kind of slow China's industrial-based development. You know, we're seeing with particularly advanced chips, we're really looking to our European partners to help align their export controls with ours to ensure that dual-use technology does not get to PRC that could then be used in a Taiwan scenario. And then the second is willingness to maybe in some, again, ideal world, a willingness eventually to maybe leverage some of our European partners that do have strong industrial bases to help ensure that we are not the only ones to Taiwan.
There's I think a couple different ways to think about this. I think most important is for governments, there's being reactive to what Trump asks, and then there's being proactive. And so I think if you're being reactive, you're gonna get not as much favor with the Trump administration. They've already been quite vocal on what they want Europe to do to help deter aggression. And I think we're gonna see a lot of more of that in the second term, right? It's defense spending generally. That's probably the number one issue for them. And that bleeds into all other discussions, whether it's support for NATO, support for allies, support for non-allies, support for other non-traditional military issues. So being proactive can help, I think, deter some of this, not just aggression from the PRC, but maybe even aggression from the USA.
With the last word. Okay, well, that brings us to a close to today's session. I apologize if we weren't able to get to all your questions here in the audience as well as online. But like I mentioned, some of our speakers may be sticking around so they can pose your question, corner them in one of our small room over here, and then they can engage them. But please join me in giving our panel.